why doesn't the lay public, particularly, just the general public, why don't they know more about science? Why don't they value science? There's a great quote that my French teacher gave me. Hold on a second. So he says, there is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. And that says it all, really. And because I have felt this throughout my, professional scientific life, that there's just the people aren't interested in it, And then if they have to deal with it, like with the COVID crisis right now, it just gets to be too much for them. They throw up their hands and they say, I can't deal with this stuff. We have to have people like Sanjay Gupta on CNN explain it to us all the time. This guy's going to wear himself out explaining all this stuff. So the question is, why do we have that problem? And it goes to the history of education in our country. And I've gone into this and I've studied it because I was interested in why this is the way it is. And the thing is, our educational process, particularly the higher education process, was all taken from the English, because we were all from England and all the early colonists and so forth. And that educational process really focused around the elite colleges and universities in England, like Cambridge and Oxford and so forth. They were started, around 1,000 years ago, around 1100, to educate the next clergyman. So they were religious schools. So that whole tradition is that a very learned, educated person was one who could quote the scriptures, who knew the Bible backwards and forwards and all the lessons in it and so forth and so on. And if you knew all that, that's all you really needed. And that was sort of the attitude. And then and that was brought over by the colonists. And two things happened, particularly in the 19th century. One was agriculture, which was the bedrock of the country, because all these settlers came and they were all basically uneducated and so forth. But what they did know how to do was to farm. But they learned as by trial and error that the more you learned about farming, the better off you were, and the better your farm was. And so both in the 18th and then the 19th, particularly in the 19th century, we started universities across this country that were land grant colleges, and they were granted by the government for agricultural schools to teach people about rotating crops and to don't exhaust the soil and all kinds of things about weather and botany, plant science kinds of things. And so science became part of the university education. But it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that the German influence was really great in the United States. And because the Germans, around the middle of the 19th century, they were really the best in the world in chemistry. And both first inorganic chemistry and then organic chemistry just grew up during the 19th century, where they discovered all these molecules that were life molecules. And so that was a sort of a halcyon time for discovering new things that were not evident before. And you really couldn't see them with your naked eye. You had to get it in the test tube and then manipulate it and so forth. And then what that created then in the educational academic life was strife, because the religious humanists, the humanists that came from a long tradition of first religion and then particularly from France in the 18th century, studying the human to try to figure out why they were so much the way they were, was sort of the de rigueur of that aspect of education. And so what happened was, evolved from that is that you could be considered an educated person if you could spout Shakespeare, quote Shakespeare, and quote the scriptures and that sort of thing. And that's all you really needed. You didn't need to know about this other stuff, this science business. Well, of course, the scientists, as time went on and up into the turn of the 20th century, the science became more and more important. And of course, in World War I, the Germans introduced chemical warfare. They used nitrogen mustard gas to gas to kill the troops. They didn't have to use bullets. They just released the mustard gas onto the battlefield, and they just dropped like flies, essentially. But that was the beginning of the downfall of German chemistry, because it was used for these nefarious uses. And after World War I, then the world got together and they said this wasn't fair play. That influenced academia. So ever since, up until the present time, there's been this battle going on between the humanists and the scientists. And the scientists have maintained you can't figure anything out just by thinking about it, just the way Aristotle did, and it doesn't work. Whereas the humanists said, oh yeah, no, there's such a thing as deductive reasoning and logic and inductive reasoning, and if you apply the principles of those kinds of disciplines, then that's what an educated person will do. And that's the thing that we really focused on in our cocktail party the other night. And I got very passionate about the fact that you had to really use the scientific method. In our society, the other part of the whole educational process that has evolved from the earliest days is a controversy between egalitarianism versus elitism in education. And of course, elitism is you give the best guy in the class is the valedictorian, and he's feted, and he's and you have laureates and all these prizes for all the really smart ones, and it fostered the idea that everybody was not created equal, as it said in our Constitution. And I've always maintained, I said, first of all, we weren't created, we evolved, and second of all, we're not equal. We're all different because we've all evolved from different progenitors, different gene pools, different things. And so some people are more gifted, more talented in intellectual kinds of things, if you will, just as if, there are some people who are better basketball players than others. Not everybody's a Michael Jordan. The idea is that you don't really have to, or what evolved was in terms of the egalitarianism, that everybody should have an equal chance. Everybody should be taught equally in grade school. You can't progress beyond grade 1 into grade 2 until you can master these particular subjects and so forth. And that is carried through all the way through our educational process. But what evolved then, because of the controversy between the humanists and the scientists, is that in our country you can be considered an educated person if you haven't had any math or science beyond the 8th grade in high school. One of my postdocs was from the Eastern Bloc, from Serbia, and he explained to me, he knew all kinds of things that I was never taught. And he explained to me that it was because of the Soviet system. The Soviets were much more applied science kinds of people, and their philosophy is that everybody should have a very fundamental basic education in science, all kinds of science, physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth, math. They had to take, advanced math up through high school. Everybody did. They didn't pat you on the shoulder and say, Sonny, you don't have to take that algebra 2. you can take, I don't know, shop or something like that. Anyway, the other thing that's happened in education of science is that, and I haven't traced this down, but somewhere along the line, the teachers got the idea that they were really drill sergeants from Paris Island and Marines, and you had to pass muster, and there were certain people who couldn't cut it, and so their job was to weed out the ones that just couldn't make it. And so they made the educational process very competitive. And what happens as a consequence of that attitude is the attitude was that not everybody can get this. Now you can imagine if you're in high school or college and you're taking French for the first time, your teacher doesn't make it hard for you. Your teacher wants to help you learn this new language. That's not the way it all goes in chemistry and physics and all this and math and so forth. They tell you, well, you're probably never going to get it, Kendall. So, and so consequently, the students just fall off. You have a high attrition rate, and by the time you get to the 9th grade or the 10th grade, you've weeded out, and you've separated people into two different camps, and they end up in the humanist camp and in the science camp. And the science camp then is in science in a general sense, it's a vertical learning process. You're putting on layers like an onion, and so you start with a little kernel, and then you put another layer on and another layer on, and you build that over the years. And if you stop that, 2 or 3 years later, you can't pick up, because now there's another few layers that have already been laid onto this thing. And a lot of the whole thing in science is that it's very much like learning a foreign language. And physics, for example, that I've never been able to master, astrophysics or small particle physics, they have their own vocabulary. I have no idea what their words mean. And I've tried to learn them, but I've realized over the years is that I there's no way unless I start at the beginning, and build it up the way you have to do that. It's the same way in biology, and biology being what it is studying life. It's very, very, very complicated, and in order for the scientists and the students and the scientists to communicate with one another, they have to define their terms, essentially. And what so often happens in science is that a word that the scientists make up, like for example, in my business, we made up, about half a dozen of us, we made up the new word of interleukin, and to designate what we were talking about, and inter meaning between and leukin meaning white blood cells. So that was interleukin. But it was a new word. And so you didn't learn that in school. And if you combine lots and lots and lots of those new words, and then what happens is, in order to, because everybody's in a hurry, because science is competitive, essentially, they reduce the word to an acronym. So we don't talk about interleukins, we talk about ILs, IL-1, IL-2, IL-3. It goes on to number 43 now. And so you have to know what the difference between IL-43 is and IL-2 on the other hand, and and so forth. And those are all broken down into very tiny little details. So there's that. And then the other thing about the whole educational process is that because the teachers are trying to weed out the poor performers, they use the testing process in order to do that weeding out process. And in the whole process of that, the actual people who do science, the scientists themselves, what kind of a person they are, and how they got to be where they were, and their whole life story and so forth, is left out. I mean, you hear about a few, maybe half a dozen or maybe a dozen very famous scientists like Galileo and Louis Pasteur and so forth, but you just know their names. You don't really know, what they did on the one hand and why they are so celebrated and so forth. And so the people are taken out of science classes and courses in school, and you're thrown all these facts. And then you got to regurgitate them on a multiple choice test. And it's not very much fun.